They were just kids, 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, but they were sentenced to die. From the youngest female ever sentenced to death to the teen who claimed demonic possession made him kill, their stories are haunting. Some were executed before they even had a chance to fight, while others lived just long enough to see the laws changed to save them. These are the 15 youngest inmates ever sentenced to death in U.S. history. Paula Cooper. Paula Cooper was just 15 years old when she was sentenced to death in Indiana, making her the youngest female death row inmate in U.S. history. Her case sparked global outrage, leading to a push for juvenile sentencing reform that ultimately saved her life. Born in 1970, Cooper had a violent and unstable childhood, suffering physical and sexual abuse at the hands of family members. By her early teens, she had dropped out of school and was involved in gang activity. But on May 14, 1985, she took part in a crime that would change her life forever. That day, Cooper and 3 other teenage girls decided to rob and kill Ruth Pelkey, a 77-year-old Bible teacher in Gary, Indiana. The attack was brutal. Pelkey was stabbed 33 times with a butcher knife, and the girls stole $10 and her car before fleeing. Cooper later confessed, saying she committed the crime for fun. At trial, the jury wasted no time convicting her, and in 1986, at just 16 years old, Cooper was sentenced to death. The ruling shocked the world, triggering an international campaign to save her life. Even Pope John Paul II publicly pleaded for clemency, arguing that a child should not be executed. The pressure worked. In 1989, the Indiana Supreme Court commuted her death sentence to 60 years in prison, citing her young age and history of abuse. Over time, Cooper transformed herself in prison, earning a college degree and becoming a model inmate. She was granted parole in 2013 after serving 27 years behind bars. Tragically, just 2 years after her release, Cooper died by suicide in 2015. Anthony Porter. Anthony Porter came within 48 hours of execution for a crime he didn't commit. Wrongfully convicted of a 1982 double murder in Chicago, Illinois, Porter spent 16 years on death row before a group of journalism students uncovered the truth that set him free. His case became one of the most shocking wrongful convictions in U.S. history and played a key role in Illinois abolishing the death penalty in 2011. Porter was 17 years old when he was arrested for the murders of Marilyn Green and Jerry Hillard, who were shot at a public swimming pool in Chicago. The case against him rested almost entirely on eyewitness testimony, but no physical evidence linked him to the crime. Despite his claims of innocence, a jury convicted him in 1983, and he was sentenced to death. Over the years, Porter exhausted his appeals, and by 1998, he was scheduled for execution. But just 2 days before he was set to die, his case was picked up by Northwestern University journalism professor David Protess and his students, who began re-examining the evidence. What they found was shocking. The eyewitness who had testified against Porter recanted his statement, admitting he had been pressured by police. The students then tracked down the real killer, All-Story Simon, who confessed on video to committing the murders. With this new evidence, Porter was exonerated and released in 1999 after spending 16 years on death row for a crime he never committed. His case became a turning point in the fight against wrongful convictions, exposing deep flaws in the criminal justice system. It played a major role in Illinois, placing a moratorium on executions in 2000 and ultimately abolishing the death penalty in 2011. Sean Sellers. Sean Sellers was just 16 years old when he committed a series of brutal murders that would ultimately land him on Oklahoma's death row. Born in 1969, Sellers had a troubled upbringing, often describing feelings of alienation and anger. He became deeply fascinated with Satanism and the occult, a fixation that would later become central to his defense. In 1985, Sellers murdered convenience store clerk Robert Bauer in cold blood. He claimed he killed Bauer simply because the man had refused to sell him beer, but that was only the beginning. Months later, in 1986, he executed both his mother, Vonda Bell Sellers, and his stepfather, Paul Bell, while they slept. Sellers would later claim that he was under the influence of a demonic entity at the time of the killings. During his trial, the prosecution painted him as a remorseless killer, dismissing his claims of demonic possession and mental illness. His defense team argued that Sellers suffered from dissociative identity disorder, DID, meaning he was not fully aware of his actions. But in 1986, he was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. On death row, Sellers underwent a transformation, converting to Christianity and renouncing Satanism. He even wrote letters warning others about the dangers of the occult. His case sparked national debate, with activists and religious leaders, including the Pope, pleading for clemency, citing his young age and possible mental illness. However, their efforts failed. On February 4, 1999, Sean Sellers was executed by lethal injection at age 29. Napoleon Beasley. Napoleon Beasley was just 17 years old when he murdered John Luddig, a prominent Texas businessman, during a botched carjacking in 1994. Born in Beaumont, Texas, Beasley was a standout student and athlete with no prior criminal record. But one fateful night, he and 2 accomplices set out to steal a car, choosing Luddig's Mercedes-Benz as their target. As Luddig pulled into his driveway, Beasley approached and shot him in the head at close range. His accomplices later testified that Beasley fired the fatal shot. The crime was made even more high-profile because Luddig was the father of federal judge J. Michael Luddig, a man with deep political connections. At trial, prosecutors wasted no time securing a death sentence, arguing that Beasley showed no remorse. His defense team pointed out that Beasley was just a teenager and had no history of violence, but the Texas jury handed down the ultimate punishment. His case took another turn, with critics arguing that Beasley's race played a role in his sentencing. He was black, his victim was white, and Texas had a long history of racial bias in capital punishment cases. Even Supreme Court Justice Sandra Day O'Connor later expressed doubts about his execution. Despite national and international pressure to halt the execution, including appeals from former President Jimmy Carter and Nobel laureates, Beasley's sentence was upheld. On May 28, 2002, at the age of 25, Napoleon Beasley was executed by lethal injection in Huntsville, Texas. James Terry Roach. James Terry Roach was 17 years old when he took part in a brutal double murder in South Carolina. Unlike others on this list, his age did not save him. He was executed in 1986, despite international protests calling for mercy. Born in 1967, Roach had intellectual disabilities and a low IQ, which some experts said left him vulnerable to manipulation. But that didn't stop him from getting involved in a violent crime that would lead to his execution. On November 26, 1977, Roach and 2 older accomplices, Joseph Carl Shaw and Raymond Hamilton, carried out a crime spree in Lexington County, South Carolina. The trio kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered 14-year-old Jackie Brooks and 17-year-old Thomas Taylor. The crime was gruesome, and when the suspects were caught, the public demanded the death penalty. At trial, Roach's defense team argued that he was not the mastermind. He was just a teenager following older, more violent criminals. His low IQ and lack of maturity should have been mitigating factors, but the jury still sentenced him to death in 1978. Over the next 8 years, human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, fought to spare his life. Even the United Nations and European leaders urged the U.S. to reconsider executing a mentally impaired teenager, but South Carolina refused to grant clemency. On January 10, 1986, at the age of 25, James Terry Roach was executed in the electric chair at the South Carolina Department of Corrections. Joseph John Cannon. Joseph John Cannon was only 17 years old when he was sentenced to death for the murder of a woman during a burglary. But his case stood out for another reason. His horrific childhood became the focal point of his defense, sparking debate over whether the death penalty should apply to juveniles who had endured extreme abuse. Born in 1979, Cannon's life was a nightmare from the very beginning. He was subjected to severe physical and sexual abuse, neglected and abandoned multiple times. By the time he was a teenager, he had already attempted suicide multiple times and was diagnosed with severe mental health issues. In 1995, at the age of 17, Cannon broke into the home of Ann Walsh, a 45-year-old Houston woman, intending to steal valuables. But when she confronted him, he shot her in the head at close range. He later claimed that the murder was not planned, but rather a spur-of-the-moment reaction fueled by panic. At trial, the prosecution portrayed him as a ruthless criminal, while his defense argued that his traumatic upbringing left him mentally unstable and incapable of making rational decisions. Despite the evidence of his severe mental health struggles, the jury sentenced him to death in 1996. His appeals focused on his history of abuse and his young age at the time of the crime, but Texas courts refused to grant him clemency. On April 22, 1998, at the age of 21, Joseph John Cannon was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. Curtis Harris. Curtis Harris was 17 years old when he was sentenced to death in Texas for the murder of a police officer. His case, however, raised serious questions about the use of coerced confessions, especially when dealing with juvenile suspects. Born in 1975, Harris grew up in poverty in rural Texas, raised by a single mother who struggled to keep her family afloat. His early years were marked by run-ins with the law, though mostly for minor offenses. But on May 22, 1992, his life took a dark turn when he was arrested for the murder of Officer James Hall in Harris County, Texas. According to the police, Harris had been involved in a robbery that ended in the officer's fatal shooting. But from the start, his defense team insisted that his confession was coerced. Harris, who had limited education and no legal guidance at the time of his arrest, was interrogated for hours. His lawyers later claimed that detectives pressured him into admitting to the crime, despite evidence suggesting he wasn't the shooter. Nevertheless, the jury sided with the prosecution, and in 1993, Curtis Harris was sentenced to death. His case gained national attention, with activists arguing that Texas had sentenced a teenager to die based on a potentially false confession. But despite numerous appeals, his sentence remained unchanged. On July 1, 1993, at the age of 18, Curtis Harris was executed by lethal injection. Roy Burgess. Roy Burgess was just 17 years old when he committed a robbery-turned-murder that led to his execution in Texas in 2000. His case, like many others, highlighted the debate over executing juveniles with traumatic pasts and whether their backgrounds should have played a role in sentencing. Born in 1982, Burgess had a deeply troubled upbringing marked by abuse, neglect, and exposure to violence. His early life was filled with instability, bouncing between foster homes and juvenile detention centers. But by his late teens, he had turned to armed robbery, a choice that would ultimately seal his fate. On June 11, 1999, Burgess and an accomplice, Michael Ellis, attempted to rob a convenience store in Houston, Texas. The robbery quickly escalated, and Burgess shot and killed the store's owner, 42-year-old Richard Powell, in what prosecutors called a cold-blooded execution. His trial was swift and unforgiving. Prosecutors emphasized his criminal history and painted him as a violent threat to society. Meanwhile, his defense team argued that Burgess had endured a lifetime of severe trauma and lacked the emotional maturity to fully grasp the consequences of his actions. The jury showed no leniency, and in 2000, he was sentenced to death. Despite multiple appeals citing his traumatic childhood and young age, the Texas courts refused to overturn his sentence. On May 4, 2000, at the age of 18, Roy Burgess was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit in Texas. Christopher Thomas. Christopher Thomas was 17 years old when he committed a murder during a store robbery, sealing his fate as one of the last juveniles executed in the United States before the Supreme Court banned juvenile executions in Roper v. Simmons, 2005. Born in Texas in 1987, Thomas had a troubled upbringing, growing up in an unstable household. He struggled in school and frequently got into trouble with the law, often for petty crimes and theft. But in 2004, his actions turned deadly. On September 12, 2004, Thomas and an accomplice entered a convenience store in Houston, Texas, intending to commit armed robbery. The situation escalated when Thomas shot and killed the store clerk, 45-year-old Daniel Vega, before fleeing the scene. Surveillance footage and witness testimonies led to his swift arrest. At trial, Thomas' defense attorneys argued for leniency, citing his young age and lack of maturity, but the jury showed no sympathy. In 2004, he was sentenced to death. Despite growing opposition to executing juvenile offenders, Texas carried out the sentence before the Supreme Court ruling could save him. On March 3, 2005, at the age of 18, Christopher Thomas was executed by lethal injection at the Huntsville unit. His execution took place just days before the Supreme Court officially ruled that executing juveniles was unconstitutional. Scott Hain. Scott Hayne was 17 years old when he committed a brutal double murder that would also make him one of the last juveniles executed in the United States before the Supreme Court outlawed the practice. Born in Oklahoma in 1970, Hayne had a troubled upbringing, spending much of his youth involved in petty crimes and delinquency. But in 1987, his crimes escalated into something far more sinister. On October 6, 1987, Hayne and his 21-year-old accomplice, Robert Lambert, carjacked a couple, Michael Houghton and Laura Sanders, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. The victims were bound and locked inside the trunk of their own car before Hayne and Lambert set the vehicle on fire, burning both Houghton and Sanders alive. The shocking cruelty of the crime horrified the public and ensured that prosecutors would seek the death penalty. At trial, Hayne's defense argued that he was just a reckless teenager following an older accomplice's lead, but the jury was unmoved. In 1988, Hayne was sentenced to death for the double murder. While on death row, Hayne's lawyers fought to have his sentence commuted, especially as the international community increasingly condemned the U.S. for executing people who committed crimes as minors. Even though the Supreme Court later ruled in Roper v. Simmons, 2005, that juveniles could no longer be executed, Hayne did not live to see that day. On April 3, 2003, at the age of 32, Scott Hayne was executed by lethal injection in McAlester, Oklahoma. Dwayne Allen Wright. Dwayne Allen Wright was just 17 years old when he committed a violent robbery-turned-murder that would lead to his execution in Virginia in 1998. Born in Virginia in 1977, Wright had a troubled childhood, often finding himself in trouble with the law from an early age. By his teens, he had dropped out of school and was deeply involved in criminal activity. On November 6, 1994, Wright and an accomplice, Douglas Christopher Thomas, carried out a botched robbery that ended in the murder of 19-year-old William Wiggins. Wright later admitted to shooting Wiggins' execution style, though he claimed it was not premeditated. At his trial, prosecutors pushed for the death penalty. Portraying Wright as a remorseless killer, his defense attorneys argued that his age and immaturity should have been mitigating factors. But the jury showed no mercy. Wright was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death in 1995. As his execution date neared, civil rights advocates raised concerns about racial bias in his sentencing. Studies had shown that black defendants were far more likely to receive the death penalty in cases where the victim was white. Furthermore, Wright had borderline intellectual disability, which his lawyers argued should have disqualified him from execution under evolving legal standards. Despite national and international protests, Wright's appeals were repeatedly denied. On October 14, 1998, at the age of 22, he was executed by lethal injection at the Greensville Correctional Center in Jarrett, Virginia. Kenneth Young. Kenneth Young was just 15 years old when he was sentenced to death in Florida, making him one of the youngest people ever put on death row in the United States. But unlike others, Young's story took a different turn. His sentence was later overturned after years of legal battles. Young was born into poverty in Tampa, Florida, and had no father figure growing up. His mother was addicted to hard substances, and by the time he was a teenager, he had fallen in with the wrong crowd. At 15, he was recruited by an older man, Willie Boatman, to participate in a series of armed robberies. In 1999, Young and Boatman carried out a botched robbery that resulted in the murder of 68-year-old Janine Mumbauer. Even though Boatman was the actual shooter, prosecutors still charged Young with first-degree murder under Florida's felony murder law, which allows an accomplice to be sentenced as if they had pulled the trigger. In 2001, Young was sentenced to death, despite being only 15 years old at the time of the crime. His lawyers fought the ruling, arguing that he was manipulated by an adult and lacked the cognitive ability to understand the consequences of his actions. After a long legal battle, Young's death sentence was overturned in 2011, following the Supreme Court's decision in Graham v. Florida, which ruled that juveniles could not receive life without parole for non-homicide offenses. Young was resentenced to life in prison. Leonard Shockley, making him one of the youngest Americans put to death in the pre-1976 era. His crime was brutal, but the circumstances surrounding his execution remained controversial. Born in Maryland, Shockley was raised in a poverty-stricken household and was known for frequent run-ins with the law from an early age. But on April 8, 1958, he and his older brother, Harold Shockley, made a fatal decision. They broke into the home of Minnie Myrtle Blake, an elderly woman living in Worcester County, Maryland. During the burglary, the situation escalated, and Minnie Blake was shot and killed. Leonard, though only 16 at the time, was quickly arrested and charged with first-degree murder. His brother, Harold, was 18 and also faced trial. But what happened next stunned many. Harold, the older of the two, was sentenced to life in prison, while Leonard, the younger one, was sentenced to death. Because Maryland law at the time allowed the execution of minors, the state moved forward with its case, despite protests that executing a 16-year-old was both cruel and unusual. On April 10, 1959, at the age of 17, Leonard Shockley was executed in the gas chamber at the Maryland State Penitentiary. Shymeek Gradine. Shymeek Gradine was just 14 years old when he was sentenced to 70 years in prison, a punishment so extreme that it became one of the most controversial juvenile sentencing cases in U.S. history. Gradine grew up in a low-income neighborhood in Jacksonville, Florida, surrounded by crime and instability. By his early teens, he had already fallen in with the wrong crowd. But on April 26, 2009, his life changed forever. That night, Gradine, along with his co-defendant, 12-year-old Rasheem White, attempted to commit an armed robbery of a man named Michael Kugler. The boys were carrying a shotgun, but things quickly spiraled out of control. In a moment of panic and inexperience, Gradine fired a shot at Kugler, hitting him in the neck and shoulder. Fortunately, Kugler survived the attack and was able to testify against Gradine in court. Under normal circumstances, a 14-year-old might have been sent to a juvenile detention facility, but Florida had some of the harshest sentencing laws in the country for minors, allowing them to be charged as adults for violent crimes. Gradine was convicted of attempted first-degree murder and attempted armed robbery. The judge handed down a 70-year sentence without the possibility of parole, a punishment that all but guaranteed Gradine would die in prison for a crime he committed as a child. His case gained national attention when juvenile justice reform advocates argued that sentencing a 14-year-old to nearly a lifetime in prison was cruel and unusual. In 2010, the Supreme Court's ruling in Graham v. Florida banned life sentences for juveniles in non-homicide cases, which forced a review of Gradine's punishment. After years of legal battles, his sentence was reduced to 25 years in 2017. Antonio Richardson. Antonio Richardson was 16 years old when he took part in a brutal murder that landed him on Missouri's death row. Unlike many others on this list, Richardson was eventually spared from execution, but not because of mercy. Richardson grew up in a troubled environment, often in and out of juvenile detention centers for minor offenses. But on April 5, 1991, he and 3 older accomplices, including Marlon Gray, committed a horrific crime now known as the Chain of Rocks Bridge murders. That night, Richardson and his accomplices kidnapped, raped, and murdered 2 sisters, Julie Carey, 20, and Robin Carey, 19, by throwing them off the Chain of Rocks Bridge into the Mississippi River. The girls drowned, and their bodies were found days later. The brutality of the crime shocked the public and led to 4 death sentences, including one for Richardson, despite him being only 16 years old at the time. His defense attorneys argued that Richardson was a follower, not a leader, and that he lacked the full maturity to understand the consequences of his actions. Nonetheless, in 1993, he was sentenced to death alongside his accomplices. For years, Richardson sat on death row, awaiting execution. But in 2005, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Roper v. Simmons, which banned the execution of offenders who committed crimes under the age of 18. This decision saved Richardson's life. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison without parole.